He was now very rich. He had gone public with his ideas. He had written a book, difficult but popular, a spirited, intelligent, warlike book, and it had sold and was still selling in both hemispheres and on both sides of the equator. The thing had been done quickly, but in real earnest. No cheap concessions, no popularizing, no mental monkey business, no apologetics, no patrician airs. He had every right to look as he looked now, while the waiter set up our breakfast. His intellect had made a millionaire of him. It's no small matter to become rich and famous by saying exactly what you think, to say it in your own words without compromise. Welcome to Positive Readings. That was from the opening pages of Saul Bellow's last novel, Ravelstein. This was published in 2000, and it's a reflection, a meditation on death. I'd like to remind everyone that they can purchase Commuting. Please look for it in the notes and check this book out. You can support the channel, and you can also discover some new writing. Thank you. Saul Bellow's Ravelstein is like his other novels. In fact, just before reading this last novel by him, I read his very first novel, Dangling Man. And as I was reading Ravelstein, I felt like it was the same author, the same narrator. This novel is written in the same style as Great Gatsby, in the sense of the main character is Ravelstein, but it's being told through a narrator like a Nick Carraway. In this case, the author's called Chick. And it's pretty obvious that Chick is a stand-in for Saul Bellow. And the novel basically follows Saul Bellow's life with his friend, Alan Bloom, who is probably best known for his book, The Closing of the American Mind, which was a criticism of what today would be called wokeness, but also just kind of political correctness and the education system. And this novel is about that rise and then what shortly followed after that, which was Alan Bloom's death. The novel became controversial because in the book, Ravelstein dies of AIDS, and it was speculated that Saul Bellow was saying or implying that Alan Bloom had died of AIDS, even though that was not, that hasn't been confirmed, it's not known. Later, in some interviews, Saul Bellow claimed that he didn't actually know if that was the case or not. I don't really think that's very important, though, for the novel. I mean, I guess if you enjoy the backstories of writers and you're a fan of Alan Bloom, you might find this book interesting. I found this book interesting maybe about halfway through, kind of getting through kind of the gossipy feel of some of the writing, where you start realizing that this is a meditation of death. This is an old man who's writing about a friend that just died who was younger than him, but also he's at the end of his life, and he's just reflecting on life. And it becomes quite interesting in that, and sad maybe, a reflection on friendship and what we have in life, and late life blooming, in the sense that Bellow, got a divorce, as most of his novels are about him going through some kind of divorce. But he got a divorce and then found a new love, and that's captured in this novel as well. So the main character is Ravelstein, and to give, as I said, this is kind of a representation of Alan Bloom. Throughout the book, Chick says that he told Ravelstein he would write a memoir from him. So it seems that we can believe that that is what Bellow had also told Alan Bloom. But again, I think maybe it's best just to think of them as their own characters. So who is Ravelstein? He's an academic. We heard from the beginning that he wrote this book and became a millionaire from it. He was urged to write the book by his friend Chick, and some other things. So as I go through this, again, this novel does not have much of a plot besides maybe more of a plot than Dangling Man, but it's really just an old academic who died, like at the end of his life, dies of an illness, and then we have the narrator who is planning to write this novel. He also gets quite sick and almost dies, but at the end, he's alive. He's ready to write the book. Some things he says about Ravelstein. Ravelstein, with his bald, powerful head, was at ease with large statements, big issues, and famous men, with decades, errors, centuries. He was, however, just as familiar with entertainers like Mel Brooks as with the classics, and could go from Thucydides' huge tragedy to Moses as played by Brooks. So we have this academic who loves to laugh. He's laughing throughout. He has these crude jokes, but he's very much a celebrant of Greek culture and Roman culture. There's one part in the novel where Saul Bellow says he thought of himself, Ravelstein thought of himself as being Greek, not Jewish. He's also Jewish, as with most of Saul Bellow's characters. What we were laughing about was death, and of course death does sharpen the comic sense, but the fact that we laughed together didn't mean that we were laughing for the same reasons. That Ravelstein's most serious ideas put into his book should have made him a millionaire certainly was funny. It took the genius of capitalism to make a valuable commodity out of thoughts, opinions, teachings. Bear in mind that Ravelstein was a teacher. He was not one of those conservatives who idolize the free market. He had views of his own on political and moral matters, but I'm not interested in presenting his ideas. More than anything else, just now, I want to avoid them. I want to be brief here. He was an educator. So throughout this book as well, we see Ravelstein kind of surrounded by his students. Bellow or Chick through, Bellow through Chick, draws a connection between Ravelstein as a teacher and the Jewish tradition, as I think at some point he says, we're a civilization of teachers. Also, he's a conservative, but he's not your typical conservative, as he says here. He doesn't idealize the free market. He's also gay. Not that conservatives can't be gay, but that's not the normal, what we normally think about with conservatives. Another passage here to highlight the man, Ravelstein. He says, he exposed the failings of the system in which they were schooled, the shallowness of their historicism, their susceptibility to European nihilism. A summary of his argument was that while you could get an excellent technical training in the US, liberal education had shrunk to the vanishing point. We were in thrall to the high tech which had transformed the modern world. The older generation saved towards the education of its children. The cost of a BA had risen to $150,000. Parents might as well flush their dollars down the toilet, Ravelstein believed. So we see this criticism of the modern age that Ravelstein had, also Alan Bloom had. He called it a European nihilism, which was, I think, at one point he calls that nihilism without the abyss. Critical of the education they're getting, critical of the professors. He wasn't liked by a lot of the professors, but had a strong following of students. One more passage just to highlight who this character was, Ravelstein. Later, this is on 127, but that isn't much more than his natural history. Others saw him as bizarre, perverse, grinning, smoking, lecturing, overbearing, impatient, but to me, he was brilliant and charming. So again, this is our little portrait of Ravelstein, but also how other people see him as well. Out to undermine the social sciences or other university specialties. He was doomed to die because of his irregular sexual ways. About these, he was entirely frank with me, with all his close friends. He was considered, to use a term from the past, an invert, not a gay. He despised campy homosexuality and took a very low view of gay pride. So again, we see kind of a a character who's conflicted. He belongs to the conservatism, yet he doesn't particularly like some of their ideas, doesn't like the free market. He's gay, but he's not about gay pride and maybe the LGBTQ stuff that we hear talked about today. In some ways, this would make him not that much different from other writers of this time. Some famous ones I can think of would be Patrick White, the Australian writer, I think first to win the Nobel Prize. A gay writer, but didn't consider himself a gay writer. Same thing with James Baldwin. Much of this novel is, besides seeing Ravelstein dying in the hospital, out of the hospital, trying to recover his ability to walk, we also just get a lot of conversations and this thinker's ideas. So despite that passage I read earlier where Chick says he doesn't want to write about his ideas, he wants to just write about the character, we still get the ideas because it would seem to be that this is all Ravelstein is. He didn't care about nature. There's a scene about that, which I'm going to get to. He really cared about humans and having discussions. Here's one that stood out. I was familiar now with Ravelstein's ideas on marriage. People are beaten at last with their solitary longings and intolerable isolation. They need the right, the missing portion, to complete themselves. And since they can't realistically hope to find that, they must accept a companionable substitute. And that reference there was to Plato's Symposium, which Ravelstein was a big fan of. So this idea that love is finding your other half. Recognizing that they can't win, they settle. The marriage of true minds seldom occurs. Love that bears it out even to the edge of doom is not a modern project. But there was, for Ravelstein, nothing to compete with his achievement of the soul. Scholars deny that Sonnet 116 is about the love of men and women, but insist that Shakespeare is writing about friendship. And earlier, just some pages earlier, when Chick is talking about visiting his second home in New Hampshire, he quotes a poem by Robert Frost. I believe this, To the Edge of Doom, is another Frost reference to an early sonnet, Into My Own by Frost. The best we can hope for in modernity is not love, but a sexual attachment, a bourgeois solution in bohemian dress. I mention bohemianism because we need to feel that we are liberated. Ravelstein taught that in the modern condition, we are in a weak state. The strong state, and this was what he learned from Socrates, comes to us through nature. So Ravelstein often looked at the modern world as this kind of pathetic, weakened state, a childhood. An earlier quote, he says that the problem of a liberated society is we all become children. And that's not explained on why that is, but that's just what he claims. And so the best they can hope for in this modern society is what he calls sexual attachment, a bourgeois solution. So we have to feel liberated, yet it's a weakened version. The strong version is in nature. And again, that's not really fully explained on what exactly that means. Perhaps one of the more interesting parts for me in this novel was when after Ravelstein got out of the hospital, he's having trouble walking, but he is up and he is moving. And the narrator, Chick, is walking with him to the university, and it's winter time, and they see these parrots that have become they've kind of taken off in Chicago. Apparently, this is a real thing, kind of house pets that got out, and they've survived, and they're all kind of ravaging this tree to eat these berries. And Ravelstein actually takes an interest in this, which surprises Chick. And this is immediately followed by this kind of moment of Ravelstein being interested in nature, which is kind of, it catches his eye for a moment, and followed by maybe an uglier side of his personality. So I like this kind of contrast here. So this is the section. He had little interest in natural life. Human beings absorbed him entirely. To lose yourself in grasses, leaves, winds, birds, or beast was an evasion of higher duties. And I think the birds held his attention unusually long because they were not merely feeding, but gorging, and he was a voracious eater himself. So this is, again, his attention on those birds. And this is contrasted with in the next paragraph. Abe, says Abe Ravelstein, Abe was taking the common drug prescribed for his condition. Again, I think in an earlier draft that would have said AIDS, but they just changed it to condition. But he didn't want it to be known. I remember how much it shocked him when his nurse walked in. The room was full of friends. She said, "It's time for your AZT." He said to me the next day, "I could have killed the woman." He was still enraged. "Don't they give those people any training? They're from the ghetto," said Nicky. Nicky is Ravelstein's lover, this younger Chinese man. "Ghetto nothing," Ravelstein said. "Ghetto Jews had highly developed feelings, civilized nerves, thousands of years of training. They had communities and laws. Ghetto is an ignorant newspaper term. It's not a ghetto that they come from. It's a noisy, pointless, nihilistic turmoil." So the content of what they're talking about here isn't fully clear when he says, "Don't they give those people any training?" I'm not sure if he means nurses or he's referring to black people, which obviously sounds racist. However, what he says about the modern state of living, I find compelling. It's a noisy, pointless, nihilistic turmoil. So this is the state that a lot of people in modern life find themselves in. And I think that sounds familiar. While I find this book enjoyable to read, even if it's just at the level of the sentence, not necessarily the whole story, there are some parts I found a bit, tiring. One big focus, obviously, in many of Saul Bellow's novels is, all his characters are Jewish, and what's the Jewish experience, even though he doesn't really seem to investigate that very deeply. More of just to kind of set himself out, or the Jewish character as an outsider. This comes up first on page 190, or on page 92, when they're talking about Chick being in New Hampshire, and it says, this is Ravelstein talking to him, he says, "As for you, Chick, you're making your total American Declaration of Rights. It's very brave of you to do it, but it's also off the wall. For miles around, you're the only Jew. Your neighbors have one another to rely on. Whom do you have? A Gentile wife? You've got a theory, equality before the law. It's a big comfort to have constitutional guarantees on your side, and it's certain to be appreciated by other devotees of the Constitution itself." So I don't think he, living in New Hampshire, I'm from New Hampshire, I don't think necessarily, granted, he's not going to, it's not going to have as many Jewish people as New York, but I don't think the isolation is going to be there. I think you have some neighbors that you can depend on. This is developed this idea more in kind of an even stranger, more bizarre way later when he's talking about this guy Morris, who had a heart transplant. And he says here, "At any rate, Morris, a German Jew, was saved by this Missouri boy, and I had to restrain myself from questioning Morris, about a heart originally Christian or Gentile, with its shadow energies and its rhythms. How did it adapt itself to Jewish needs or peculiarities, pains, and ideas?" I think it is quite a strange concept to have someone else's heart in your body, have a heart transplant and be living that way. But this idea that the Jewish heart has shadow energies and some other type of rhythm, like as if it's different from other people's hearts, I don't think doesn't sound to me like a very healthy view of people. And this comes, I guess, to a climax a little later This is on page 132 when he's talking to his new wife, Rosamond. And he says, of course, that's what the conversation is circling, meaning the Holocaust. What it means to the Jews that so many others, millions of others, willed their death. The rest of humankind expelled them. Hitler was on record as having said that once he was in power, he would have gallows and rows put up in Marienplatz in Munich, and the Jews, to the last Jew, would be hung there. It was the Jews that were Hitler's ticket to power. He didn't have, nor did he need, any other program. He became chancellor by uniting Germany and much of the rest of Europe against the Jews. And he brings this up because he's wondering about this friend of his ex-wife who he thinks was perhaps working with the Nazis during the war. And I mean, when I read this, one of the notes I wrote here was, could it have anything to do with Jews thinking their hearts were different from Gentiles? Or is that a perspective and a product of the Holocaust? So is this view that we are somehow different? We have these shadow energies that he talks about. Is that a view? Is that a product of the Holocaust from having, as he said, people give up on you, expel you? Or was the expulsion a product of thinking that the hearts are different? Again, Bellow doesn't really go into this. I don't think he really addresses the real issues around being Jewish at all. It's more of just a thing that separates him from others. After Ravelstein's death, the narrator Chick and his new wife Rosamond, they moved to Boston because Chick gets a job at Boston University. Again, this is what really happened in Saul Bellow's life. Then they go on a trip to the Caribbean. There, Chick gets violently ill, just barely gets back to Boston in time before he's put into the ICU, almost dies. And after that, he's recovering. This is his reflection, and again, kind of bringing us back to the project of this whole book. There was no subject raised which she didn't immediately understand. This is Rosamond, his wife. Ravelstein would have been well pleased with her. Of course, he'd never had my advantage, the access to her that I had. And after the crisis, this sickness, Rosamond said she never doubted that I would survive. And I seemed to believe that I wouldn't die because I had things to do. Ravelstein expected me to make good on my promise to write the memoir he had commissioned. To keep my word, I'd have to live. Of course, there was an obvious corollary. Once the memoir was written, I lost my protection, and I became as expendable as anybody else. So there's this notion that I've survived, and now I need to write this memoir, almost like a god looking over him, and there's some kind of protection that I have to write this memoir. And then once that's done, then my fate is open. I could die. And I think sure enough, 5 years after this book was published, Saul Bellow did pass away. Last part, kind of wrapping up this book, I think it ends nicely. He's remembering Chick, he's remembering Ravelstein, and this is what he says. He loses himself in sublime music. This is again Ravelstein. A music in which ideas are dissolved, reflecting these ideas in the form of feeling. He carries them down into the street with him. There's an early snow on the tall shrubs, the same shrubs filled with a huge flock of parrots, the ones that escaped from cages and now build their long nest sacks in the back alleys. They are feeding on the red berries. Ravelstein looks at me, laughing with pleasure and astonishment, gesturing because he can't be heard in all this bird noise. You don't easily give up a creature like Ravelstein to death. And I thought that was a touching last line. You don't easily give up a creature like Ravelstein to death, because that's essentially, again, what this book is. It's Bellow working out giving up his friendship, or giving up his friend to death by memorializing him through the contents of this book. In that case, maybe it's a very personal book, but I think it's a pleasure to read because, again, you see a character, even with some faults, truly reflecting on life and death. Thank you for listening.